and welcome back to the Middling Along podcast. I'm your host, Emma Thomas, and my guest today is Dr Stella Duffy OBE. She is an existential psychotherapist, has just completed her PhD, which we'll come back to shortly, I hope, and as an author has written 17 novels, 15 plays and 70 short stories. She's previously been an actor, a theatre director, a comedian and much more. Having previously survived 2 encounters with cancer, last summer, with no warning, she suffered a ruptured brain aneurysm that very nearly killed her. Despite this, she's recently successfully defended her PhD thesis, being the first in her family to complete secondary schooling, never mind go on to university, and then to do a PhD. Welcome to the podcast, Stella.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, I did go on to do a PhD, but not until I was 55. So it took a long time for me to think that academia was possible for me, really. And it took a lot of life for me to have the courage and the money, actually, because it's not cheap. I didn't have a funded PhD to be able to do it. I don't think I could have ever afforded to do it until I was in my mid-50s, when a whole lot of other costs had been taken care of by life.
Quite often I think people sort of get to kind of this point in life, that sort of, I don't know if you want to call it a halfway point, an inflection point, and suddenly start thinking about a sort of a pivot or a going after something that they've always wanted to do. So, I mean, is that, why did you decide to do the PhD at this point? What sort of led up to you choosing that as a subject?
Having cancer for the second time, basically. So in my 20s, I was an actor. In my 30s, I sold my first novel just before I turned 30. I was a novelist and an actor. In my 40s, I was more directing theatre and writing. In my 50s, I co-founded and co-directed an organisation that supports communities all over the UK to co-create their own creative events, Fun Palaces, which are still going. And then at 50, as well as founding Fun Palaces, I had my second breast cancer, and kept on and was part of the steering committee that founded the Women's Equality Party and worked like mad. And
I didn't know you were involved in founding the Women's Equality Party.
So when Catherine Mayer came home from the WOW Festival in, it must have been 2014, and late at night put on her Facebook page, if I was to found a Women's Equality Party, who'd be with me? Well, I was the first person who said yes. And Sophie Walker, who I didn't know at the time, who
brilliant.
The, leader of the party for quite a while, was the second person. And it was also my birthday. So I really know about the
And they've just had a councillor elected in Basingstoke-on-Dean, which is
right?
Brilliant.
And so that year, I was just working like a mad woman, because I was mad. I was running away from my second cancer as fast as I possibly could. I had 5 surgeries. I mean, it was just a lot. And partly because I'd had my first cancer in my mid-30s, that kind of made me middle-aged. You know, I'm pretty clear that 50 is not middle-aged. Not unless you're going to be 100, and I'm certainly not. I don't know who else is, but I know that I'm not going to live that long. No one in my family does, and I've been pretty ill, so I don't think it's possible. But by the time I'd gotten to 50, I'd had 13, 14 years cancer-free. And so I sort of believed that I'd made this trade-off, which was a big trade-off. I agreed to have chemotherapy at 36, knowing it would highly likely make me infertile. And that was just at the point we were trying to have children. And so it did make me infertile, and I'm childless not by choice. I had 5 embryos made before chemo, and all of them died inside me. But I think I kind of felt like I'd made a trade-off with the universe.
Yeah.
You know, I'll take the chemo to stay alive. I'll lose my fertility, which really matters to me, and I won't get cancer again. And I know that's not rational, but I don't think the trade-offs we often make with the universe are very rational.
Absolutely not.
So when I was 50 and diagnosed with my second breast cancer, it really felt like a big slap in the face. And partly because of this irrational trade-off, I only realised I'd made in retrospect as well. And so I kept on working. I mean, partly because I'm freelance and I've never had sick pay. I've been freelance since I was 17. I've never had sick pay. I've never had compassionate leave, and I've never had holiday pay. And I think it's a thing that doesn't get talked about enough, actually, around the menopause work that you and I both do, around the sickness work, around cancer work. We do not talk enough about freelancers. And it's incredibly difficult to be freelance and going through major embodied transitions. So anyway, I kept working. And by the time it was sort of towards the end of 2015, as a therapist, I don't really use the term breakdown, but I can't think of anything better. I pretty much had a breakdown. I was doing too much. I was living with too much. I was still recovering. I was working like a demon with work that I really cared about,
Do you think there was something about sort of trying to pack as much into that period of time as possible?
I absolutely think so. I mean, I also, I'm the youngest of 7 kids from a council estate in South East London. I'm really bloody fortunate that I got to stay at school long enough to even go to university, unlike my siblings, who are bright, smart people, but had to leave school at 15 and 16 and get jobs. There wasn't money. My parents both had to leave school at 14. There wasn't money for them to stay at school. So I've always had a sense that I have to do something that makes a difference, that gives back, that acknowledges my privilege. And so I was really involved in a lot of activism work. And I just wasn't coping. I simply wasn't coping. And what happened was I rang up the hospital where I'd had my 5 surgeries for my second breast cancer. And I said, I really need some support. What have you got? And the first time round, there wasn't, we do now, and I've worked with the cancer service myself as a therapist. We do offer fairly routinely, maybe 6 to 8 sessions. It's not a lot, but it's something. But with my first cancer, there was no offer like that at all. I found a cancer therapist privately and funded it privately. But I did know that, by 2015, maybe there was a bit more going on. So I rang up the hospital and they said, sure, we've got somebody for you. And then as it turned out, she and I had had a connection in the past, so I couldn't see her. So then they said, okay, wait a few more weeks and we'll find someone else for you. And I was like, okay, fine, but I think I'm desperate. And they rang up that morning that I was supposed to be seeing this woman. And they said, I'm really sorry, she can't see you. I don't know what happened. I think she might have had a sudden bereavement. But it was the day I was supposed to be going for the appointment. And I remember so clearly, I was standing in the street near my house. I was waiting to get a bus. And I just remember being on the phone to the young woman on the phone and saying, I need some help and I need it now. Don't you have anyone? And she said, well, we do have someone, but it's a man and he's quite a lot younger than you. And I was like, I don't care.
Put him on.
It's not about the gender or the age. I'm not coping with the fact that my mortality came and slapped me in the face twice. Anyway, the psychotherapist they ended up giving me for 8 sessions was an existential psychotherapist. And I had not come across existential work.
Can you explain what that is? Because I imagine it's certainly not something that I understand. So It would be nice to understand what it is.
So, and this is what my training has been. So when we work existentially, it's not that we're not interested in your childhood. We are. We are interested in how shit your mother was and how awful your father was and how crap your teachers were. We are, genuinely. But we're more interested in you. What choices have you made? What choices do you want to keep making? What choices are you making because you believe you have no choice? And where do you want to change? So it's acknowledging that the past lives in us all the time, but it's also, well, where are you right now? And it also really strongly acknowledges how much we are affected by society. So traditional psychoanalysis is very intrapersonal. It's me, it's my demons, it's my history, it's my past, it's my internal workings. Existentially, we're working intersubjectively. We know we live in the world. If I'm working with a black client, I know that black client is living in a racist society and it's going to affect them. If I'm working with a queer client, I know that I'm working with a queer person, as I am, who is living in a homophobic society, and it's going to affect us. When I work with people who are childless not by choice, I know it affects us because we live in a pronatal culture. When I work with mothers, I know it affects us because we live in a culture that tells mothers they can't ever get anything right, ever. And what we do existentially is we look at who we are now, the world in which we're living, and where we might want to make change. But it's very much interested in choice. And what I came to realize was I was making some choices that were not good for me. And I think all of us can know that, but doing something about it is the hard bit.
Yeah.
And that's where, for me, existential psychotherapy in particular opened up. Honestly, I've described this as feeling like I'd spent my entire life with a very fine wall made of, I don't know, rice paper. And it feels like it was on my left-hand side. And just in these conversations with this existential therapist, it sort of opened this wall, this screen. And I saw that there was a whole other world that I hadn't thought was accessible to me, a world of philosophy, a world of a different way of thinking. I mean, I've had a Buddhist practice for over 30 years, and yet I still felt like the more philosophical thinking wasn't accessible to me. And I realized very slowly it was. So when I went, long-winded way of telling you that when I went back to do my training, I chose a course which is an existential psychotherapy training, and it is a doctorate course, but you can leave after 1 year and you've got a PG cert. You can leave after 2 years, you've got a PG dip. And I could have left after 3 years with an MA, well, maybe 4. But it's taught modularly and it just takes interest. And so I knew that I could commit to at least a year. I knew I could maybe commit to 2 years. I didn't have to commit to a 4-year doctorate in advance without knowing I was capable of doing it.
Well, and particularly if you're self-funding, that's a huge thing to take on.
Like me and all of my cohort, we worked all the way through. So we all carried on the jobs that we were doing till at least our second year. And then we started our private practices once we got our registration. And we were doing training and writing our theses and working all at the same time. And that was tiring too, but brilliant.
You decided to look at experiences, voices of sort of post-menopausal subjects. And obviously, as a society, we're discussing menopause a lot more, but there's not been that much interest, seemingly, in that sort of after period. You know, what comes next? We're talking a lot about that transition, but not. And I think, you know, for some of us, we will be spending maybe half our adult lives in that post-menopausal state.
Yeah. For any of us who live long enough, post-menopause is likely to be a third of our life. Now, one of the reasons I think we haven't been talking about it is because the people who are making a huge amount of money by monetizing menopause don't get any value when we hear the voices in post-menopause going, it's better out the other side.
They're like, go away.
Go away. I need to keep selling you this product, that product. I mean, the way the way menopause has been monetized in the past 5 years really shocks me. I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but it shocks me. You know, menopause chocolate? Oh, piss off. Seriously, you're selling me some dark chocolate with some nuts in it. I can go and do that myself. It is shocking to me the way that people are jumping on this bandwagon of going, oh, here they are. Here's the women. They're suffering.
We've ignored all of you for decades, and now suddenly we've realised you've got some spending power, and there's another way to get the money out of you.
Exactly. So partly they don't want us to know that there's more of our lives after menopause. They really don't want us to know that, because if we know that, we're not going to spend all of our time going, oh my God, my menopause is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Now, for me, my menopause wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to me because it coincided with 6 months of chemotherapy and becoming infertile. That was a damn sight worse than being menopausal. Menopausal was part of my infertility. It was as a result of my chemotherapy. But frankly, I had much harder things to worry about, even though I was having 40 hot flushes an hour. There was 1 hour, seriously, when I first started chemo, because it just changed everything literally overnight. 1 hour where I counted 40 hot flushes. It was the most shocking thing. But my body was already dealing with a major physical change. I was already dealing with a major emotional change. And, you know, there's some really interesting research. So there's a story out there, and it's a bit disturbing to me, that Black women experience stronger vasomotor symptoms, so the physical symptoms, and white women experience stronger psychological and emotional symptoms. Well, you know what? We might also be looking at the fact that perhaps Black women have been put off complaining to their doctors because they knew they weren't heard. And perhaps Black women have been trained they have to tolerate and put up with more shit than a lot of white women. What we do know is that people who have experienced trauma and adverse childhood effects, be that poverty, be that racism, be that abuse, sexual, domestic violence, whatever, that those people experience more problems. And one of the things that showed up in my research is perhaps the women who aren't complaining are not complaining because they're not experiencing anything, but because other hard stuff is going on in their lives. I had women of colour and disabled women in my research saying, look, it's not that my menopause wasn't difficult, but I had a lot of other stuff going on.
Yeah, in the great scheme of things, it was not notable.
One of my participants, Elena, she says, it's not that it wasn't hard, but I've got 2 black sons and I'm bringing them up in an inner London suburb, and I need to bring them up to not be members of the patriarchy. She was worried about their safety. She was worried about them being, stopped and searched by random police check. She was worried for them, and it gave her other shit she had to worry about. One of the women who I didn't end up interviewing actually said to me, she said, look, I'm a white middle-class woman. I've had a lot of privilege. My menopause was the first time I understood what it was like to be made an outsider. And I suspect that might be true for quite a few people, that if they haven't had difficulties beforehand, menopause really does come as a shock. So I'm not saying it's not a shock and it's not hard for them. But when we say it's only hard for this specific group of people, we need to look at why the other people aren't saying it's hard. And maybe they're not saying it's hard because they've got so much else on their plate. And maybe one of the things we need to be doing is looking at what else is going on. Because part of the difficulty when we talk about menopause is it's become so biomedically associated. And yet what we know from looking at things socioculturally is that everything else plays in. So one of the things that I'm finding quite difficult to hear at the moment is people saying, I need to medicate for my anxiety in menopause. And I'm a bit like, well, do you? Because what's your anxiety showing you? It's showing you that something's wrong. It's showing you that something's going on and that maybe you want to deal with the something that's going on rather than shut up your anxiety. And as one of my participants said, perhaps what's going on is sexism, misogyny, patriarchy, and I'm in my mid-50s and I've spent all these years being shut up. And my anxiety and my anger are these voices wanting to get out. And I do find it disturbing that there is quite a push towards either saying, well, HRT will help your anger and your anxiety, or antidepressants will help your anger and your anxiety. What if we're allowed to be anxious and angry? What if, one of my participants puts this brilliantly, she says, what if it is patriarchy? And there's no pill for patriarchy. What if my anger is allowed to exist? What if after 5 odd decades of putting up with being shut up, I'm allowed to shout, it's not fair and I want change? So and from a psychotherapeutic point of view, I really want to stress, I would not say don't use antidepressants, don't use HRT. Of course, if it suits you, if it suits your body, if it works for you, go for it. But don't just dismiss your anger and anxiety as if they have no place.
Yeah, it's not happening to us in a vacuum, is it?
They are really useful signals that perhaps something is going on that it might be worth looking at because you might want to make some changes.
And I think sometimes the voices that we do hear aren't terribly diverse.
No.
If we're not hearing from people who are queer, who are sort of childless, not by choice, people who live with chronic pain, with disability, we're seeing that quite limited representation of what menopause is and how it shows up in the world. What are we losing out on by not hearing those voices, the sort of, some of the people that you were talking to in part of your research?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we're losing out on is a diverse representation of what menopause can be. So if you look at it globally, Northern European women and maybe so Denmark, Canada, Australia, some parts of Britain and some parts of North America have really high incidences of vasomotor symptoms, hot flushes and cold sweats. If you look more globally, though, you'll see that where people have different diets from childhood. So the difficulty here is we can't just go, oh, I'm going to change my diet at 50. So we're looking at different diet from childhood. We see really different symptomology. So Highland, Mayan, Guatemalan women, for example, there's a fantastic study, Bayen and Martin, can't remember what year it is, but Bayen and Martin did major study looking with MRI and X-ray scans on osteoporosis. And they compared the bodies of Highland, Guatemalan women and North American women. And the bodies were equally osteoporotic. So the scans showed, these women in their 70s, they showed the same amount of osteoporosis in both groups.
Mm-hmm.
But the Mayan women didn't have any fractures at all. And you know how a fracture shows up on an X-ray 20 years later, right? They had none. And what they think it is that their diet has high calcium from the water from childhood. They exercise throughout life because they are carrying water to crops, often 2 miles this way and 2 miles back twice a day, well into their 70s. And they don't drink alcohol. And so what you've got a diet from childhood onwards that supports your physical fitness, because if we are supporting the muscles around our bones, the bones may still become problematic, but if the muscles are holding them, then it's not going to go in the same way. And now that study, it's a very in-depth scientific, using proper, they carted MRI machines up mountains. And so what we're hearing too much, I think, is you've got to do this now at 55 so that you're not osteoporotic and a problem on, for the NHS at 75. Well, actually, we need to be looking at our daughters at 5, at 15, at 25. We need to be looking at all of our ages. And it's not too late for us. I'm 61. I do as much exercise as I can. I live with chronic pain and I still do as much exercise as I can because it helps chronic pain. We need to be looking at diet change from the beginning. We do eat too much fat in the white, wealthy West. We do drink too much alcohol. It's really, people get shouted down, particularly the alcohol thing, when they talk about alcohol. And there is a bit of a culture that says, please don't tell me I'm not allowed to drink, things are hard enough as it is. And I've said that myself, although I haven't drunk for 6.5 years now, but I certainly have in the past. And it is problematic. And our drinking rates are too high for our own physical well-being and for our emotional well-being. Alcohol is deeply problematic. It's a depressive. And so we are coming from cultures when we are doing our menopause research on white women, which is what the majority of menopause research in Northern Europe and North America for decades has been on the bodies of white middle-class mothers.
So we're only seeing this tiny percentage of what's happening.
In another 5 years, 25% of women are not going to be mothers. It's not a small minority. If we're 1 in 4, it's not that small a group. We have to extend our research because we can learn from the cultures who are experiencing it differently. There's a lot of there's 34 menopausal symptoms and they're all this, but there's 100 of them worldwide. And other cultures have them really differently. Japanese women, traditionally used to get cold chills rather than hot flushes. Then we told them they were having hot flushes, started selling them HRT, and now they have a word for hot flush, but it's a transliteration of English. They didn't even have that term. They had a Japanese term that didn't mention the word hot. And they used to get aching shoulders. Beautiful story. Older Japanese women reported aching shoulders as a menopausal symptom. And it was believed that it was because they could no longer hold a baby.
Oh.
Isn't it lovely? I mean, not that you can't hold someone else's baby, but you're not making your own baby. I just think that's gorgeous. That's just a beautiful way of looking at it. The Highland Mayan Guatemalan women also call their hot flushes the rising of the animal spirit.
Oh, that's a good one.
I know. That's partly because they live in a culture that respects older women. And so I grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I had the great good fortune of growing up in a town where there was a huge Maori, Samoan, Tongan, Niue, and Polynesian population. And Polynesian culture has a space for older women. It has a respectful space for older women. Polynesian culture also has spaces for trans people, for non-binary people. The terms takatapui and whakawahine and whakatane have been in existence for a long time. They were closed down by white colonizers, of course.
Of course.
but these are cultures where non-binary, non-trad, non-heterosexuality and respect for women has always been part of it, and respect for aging. And if we look at the global research in cultures where there is respect for aging, menopausal symptoms, because it's physiological and psychological, menopausal symptoms are way down. Our culture, I'm looking out my window at southeast London, this 2024 British culture does not have respect for our aging. It is deeply ageist.
How do we get that back? Is there a way back?
I think we have to deal with our internalized ageism. I've really had to confront my own internalized racism as a white woman, my internalized pronatalism as a childless woman, who I realized, I'd been really struggling with my childlessness for such a long time. And the thing that got me to let it go and let it be how it is I realized, I bought into that too. I too believed that I would be a graduate woman if I was a mother. I too believed when mothers said, I never felt any love like it. You don't understand. I was like, oh yeah, no, you're right. I don't. Well, how can I compare? Maybe I have felt love like it. I don't know, because I don't have the two experiences to compare. I do know I'm a different person now, childless, than I was before I tried to have children. My childlessness has been a similar transition to that of parenting that I've seen with my parent friends. But I had to confront my pronatalism, my belief that being fertile was also better than being infertile. I have had to really confront my internalized ageism. Years ago, I was talking about my ageism and the same therapist, this younger man. And I was saying about being older. And he said, but you're not older, you're old. I was like, how very dare you, young man. And I was like, oh, shit. Okay, right. I'm doing it too. I'm saying that old is wrong. I too have bought into an idea that...
But that's what everything tells us, right? Everything around us tells us that it's worse, that it's less than.
Yeah, it's worse and less than. Exactly. But if we don't start with ourselves, then we're not going to fix it out there. So my choice has been to say I'm old. I'm 61, and I've had so many 75-year-olds say, don't say you're old, because I'm 75. I'm like, do you call yourself what you want? I'm at the beginning of old. I'm not middle-aged. I'm not going to be 120. It's not going to happen. I'm not in the middle anymore. And frankly, given how ill I've been, I don't know how long I've got. So I might as well acknowledge my age and embrace that. And I really think that when we stop pretending that when we're menopausal, it doesn't signify aging, it doesn't signify mortality. When we who are menopausal learn how to embrace, this is my body reminding me I am going to die, that we then get the great grace of, well, what the fuck am I going to do with this 20 years?
The liberation.
This 30 years, yeah? I mean, back to Mary Oliver. If this is my one wild and precious life, I better live it now. And maybe, therefore, my anger and my rage and my anxiety have a place. Maybe my desires have a place.
I think one of the I picked out this quote on your website, which actually reminds me of something that Heather Corinna says in their book, What Fresh Hell Is This? And they've been also on the podcast. And you say, maybe you don't have to do menopause brilliantly. Maybe it would be okay to be however you are and find out who you are becoming in post-menopause. And yeah, I feel you've talked a little bit about the sort of the monetization, the sort of the menopause industrial complex, if you like. Are we under this intense pressure to have a good menopause in inverted commas? And how do we rebel?
Well, we're supposed to have a good menopause, but then we're also supposed to be. So I was running a workshop on this last night about dreaming our creative post-menopause. And we came up with 3 main tropes. We've either got to be a very wise, lovely old lady, Miss Marple, right? She looks lovely on the outside. She's super clever and quite a bitch sometimes. And she's really snarky and really sharp and sits there quietly knitting and getting everything right and knowing everything. So you've got that one. You've got the wizened old crone, and you've got to embrace your crone, and you've got to embrace your wrinkles, and you've got to be super wise and wild and, just take all of that on.
Barefoot in the mossy highlands or something.
All the time.
Kind of.
Or you've got to be, I don't know, super fit, super strong, showing off your six pack and your brilliant biceps and doing handstands at 75. And, what about just being anywhere that suits you? What would it be like to be menopausal and begin thinking, in this transition, who do I want to be becoming? And if none of those three things work for me, or if only a tiny bit of one of them and a tiny bit of another work, wouldn't it be okay for me to dream and create my own post-menopause? This might be the only time in our lives, because at puberty, I think we're far too young to sort of go, oh, how am I going to be for the rest of our life? It's such a big shock, right? The shock of parenthood and the shock of infertility, they're both really difficult transitions. It doesn't matter how much you want the baby, it's still bloody difficult when it first arrives. And it doesn't matter how much you want the baby, it's still bloody difficult when it doesn't arrive. So those transitions are really problematic. The menopause transition, however hard it is, comes at a time in our lives when we have had some adulthood behind us, when we've had some awareness, when we've been through some stuff already. And quite often we're still going through stuff, particularly those of us who are caring. My wife was a carer for her mother for 9 years throughout all of her 50s. And it was really problematic as her mother became more and more ill. And that juggling of having to hold the bulk of caring responsibilities still, we see this from the COVID stats, that women are still holding the bulk of it. For trans and non-binary people, that huge drama of still being ostracized, still being attacked. For queer people, just the same. So what we've got, though, is we also have an opening opportunity where our body goes, something is going on. A change is here. You are living a change. However difficult that involuntary embodied change is, it is also a wake-up call to, well, what do you want? How do you want to be? And I think rather than having to do this successful menopause, whether for you that's taking menopausal hormone therapy or taking, nothing at all and going through it, or not experiencing any symptoms at all, which quite a large number of people do, but we never talk about that.
Yep.
And, the negativity bias is strong. I really think we need some voices of the ones who did do the sailing through. Good. I want to hear from them, because I'd quite like to know what they were doing at 15 and 20 in case it helped. If it did help, let's be giving that to our 15 and 20-year-olds now. There's a little bit of an attitude in the menopause community if we don't want to hear from the ones who sailed through, that they should just shut up because it's too hard for the rest of us. And while I get that attitude, and I certainly felt it when I was menopausal, having chemotherapy at 36, I would like to hear from them, because I want to know if what they did earlier was different than what other people did.
So interesting, isn't
because
it?
we could be then. If that's true, then we need to be offering that to our younger women and children. We really do. But beyond that, it's an embodied wake-up call. We are aging. We are going to die. The death of our fertility, which I experienced at 36, is a great opportunity to revision what we understand womanhood to be, or personhood. It's a great opportunity to the change in our sexuality. It's a great opportunity to wonder, well, what sex do we want?
Or do we want any at all?
Karen Gurney, right, who is on Instagram as the sex doctor, has some great stats around your standard penis and vagina sex means that your average woman is not going to have an orgasm. It's about 70% of women do not orgasm from penis in vagina sex. And the vast amount of men do. And then you get hormonal changes that means maybe your vagina doesn't necessarily experience a penis inside it as comfortable as it used to. Then maybe now would be the time to start saying, hi, this is how I have orgasms. And let's change what we're doing. There's a lovely study Amini and McCormick, and it's on older Iranian women. And what they experience in menopause is that for the first time in their lives, they had the sex they wanted to because they weren't worried about getting pregnant because they didn't have access to contraception. And we really need to remember this when we talk about how terrible the loss of periods is or the loss of our fertility is. On a global basis, for a vast majority of women, it is freedom from unwanted pregnancy. And that's so important. But these women, not all of them, but some of them said, I got to speak with my husband for the first time about the sex I wanted. And there's also studies saying that, lesbian relationships, because we've had to talk about the sex we wanted, because the trad just do it like this is what it looks like in the movies, wasn't available to us, meant that in menopause and post-menopause, we've already been having those conversations. I mean, I really think the menopause community just needs some queering, really. We've been talking about sex differently as queer people for a long time. And if postmenopausally sex is different or difficult, then have different conversations. Don't assume your body is the same now as it was at 19. It's not. It can't be. Nor should it be. We've changed.
Yeah. And definitely, in terms of what you were talking about, finding out what it is that we want to be doing, need to be doing, I think all of that sort of socialization of us as sort of putting ourselves down the to-do list, we talk about this as you talk about it as an invitation to break out of that conditioning of not actually vocalizing what you want, whether it's kind of from the point of view of sex or what you do with your life or, who you spend the rest of that time with. Yeah, sometimes it's actually very difficult to articulate what you want.
I think so. And I think it can really help to just ask ourselves on a daily basis. I'm not saying I'm skilled at this. It's something I'm learning and getting better at slowly. But when I work with clients about this, what we talk about is there's two ways of saying, what do I want? One is, what do I want? Actual me, this me now, not me 5 years ago or 5 minutes ago, but this me right here and now in this world, in this life, what do I want? And sometimes we might have been saying what I want, and actually it's what our family wants, or our kids want, or our partner wants, or our mum and dad wanted for us decades ago, but we're still believing it's what I want. Or our society tells us we're supposed to want. And the other one is, what do I want? Really underline the want. What makes my body blossom? What brings a smile to my face? And that way we can begin to understand how we might follow our desire. And so there are two ways of asking the same question, and they're both really important. One is about who am I now? And one is about what can I offer myself? And if we're not going to do it in menopause and post-menopause, it is never going to happen.
So a new muscle you need to flex.
And it needs work, and that's fine. None of this happens overnight. That's why it's a transition. Hurrah! Your perimenopause lasts 10 years. I know, that's a pain in the ass, but it is 10 years where you can go, I have 10 years to let my change happen.
You don't have to figure it all out overnight.
It's not happening overnight. None of us, well, some of us had to do it overnight, but the difficulty there is that we're pushed into it. So I work quite a bit with young women with cancers, and what it's like to be pushed into that overnight. And we can still take a breath and go, okay, well, I'm here now, and I didn't want to be, but what do I want now? So it's not that it's impossible for those of us that don't get a long transition. It just means we have to address it slightly differently.
So what does Stella want next?
Well, Stella would quite like to stop having health dramas, which I'm hoping to do quite soon. I have a little bit more surgery to go, but hopefully I'm going to be as well as humanly possible after a couple of things to do this year, ideally. And then beyond that, I feel like the work I'm doing now, the psychotherapy work come together with everything else, is probably the most creative work I've ever done in my life. It's all of my storytelling work, it's all of my artwork, it's all of my writing work, and it's all come together in supporting other people to tell their stories. So, I don't know, the creative post-menopause group, quite interested in seeing if we could do that. I led my first creative post-menopause in-person workshop last night. We created zines for ourselves and what we might...
Cool.
I know, I was really excited about about the different elements of ourselves we want to support as we grow and change. I honestly don't know, Emma, but I love finding out.
Good. Well, for those of you who are listening and still trying to work out what you want, I hope that this conversation has been helpful and thought-provoking. And thank you so much, Stella. It's been absolutely joyful chatting to you and hearing a bit more about your story, what you've been doing, where you're going. I love the idea of creating a zine. I really want to do more. So I want to do more creative stuff. It's very hard to find time, but it's always really rewarding whenever I do.
And Emma, one of the reasons you might find it hard to find time is that this very successful and very useful podcast, I can imagine, doesn't leave you enough time, as well as everything else you do. It would be all right for you to go, one podcast, one creative element for me. One podcast, 5 minutes, 10 minutes to let your creative self flow.
Yeah.
Because you're giving out such a lot in creating this. Those of you who are running these podcasts, and I know that loads of us love them, you are giving such a lot. And that means you need a bit of feeding too.
Oh, thank you. Well, where can people find you if they want to find out a bit more about your work, follow you on social media?
Stella Duffy Therapy or Stella Duffy Blog, either of those will work. But if you Google me, it tends to come up. There are other Stella Duffys, but I'm the one who's shouted the loudest, I think. So.
Excellent. We'll put some links into the show notes. Thank you again for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you, Emma.
You've been listening to the Middling Along podcast. Do remember to subscribe to be notified when our next episode is live. And why not visit the blog at www.middlingalong.com to sign up to my newsletter as well. I do hope you enjoyed listening today. If you did, I'd be really grateful if you would consider leaving a short review, as that helps people find the podcast and helps get it noticed. Hope you can join us next time. Goodbye for now.